So, hi Ed, welcome to No Idea Whatsoever. So, Ed, my first question to you is, did you know what you were going to do when you grew up, or did you have no idea whatsoever?
It depends on what age, I guess. When I was very little, I had a very fixed view that I was going to become a zoologist because that's what David Attenborough was. And I was obsessed with his books and his television programs.
Yeah.
So I think probably from the age of about 8 till probably, I would say 17 or 18, that's all I wanted to do. But once I got into the world of university, I probably started to have less of a clue. And it was probably only after postgraduate study that I started to have a kind of view as to what I would like to do. I'm very interested in science generally, and I'm quite interested in the communication of science. And so I guess teaching was a natural fit if I wasn't going to be David Attenborough. And he was still, and is still, very much going with respect to kind of presenting wildlife programs. So there didn't seem to be the gap in the market that needed an Ed Richardson as opposed to a David Attenborough.
And where did you go to school in the UK? I mean, I know you're in the UK. Which school were you in?
So senior school, I went to a school called Cheltenham College, which is a Victorian public school based in the Cotswolds in the west of England. And then before that, I went to a little prep school called Aberley Hall. And before that, I went to a little local school called St Edward's and had a lovely time at each. Yeah, I really enjoyed school, the sort of holistic nature of British education and the fact that you could be learning, in the classroom and enjoying that, but also accessing lots of opportunities outside of the classroom or supercurricularly or extracurricularly. And I really enjoyed that kind of roundedness of my education, I think, and thrived in it because I think there were certain areas of my education where I definitely found it more challenging.
And what would you say, was one of the key things that, or what do you think were the extracurricular activities that the school really focused on?
I mean, for me personally, I think people from the outside looking in would suggest that I was pretty sporty, but I don't think the school necessarily accelerated that, encouraged that more or over and above other things like music or drama or art or something like that. I think there's also something slightly more binary or reduced than those kind of fields. I think British education, at least now reflecting back on it in my position, I'm able to realize that I think these things, sport, music, art, drama, debating, the societies, the activities, all the things you can do, they're all great, brilliant and interconnected. But ultimately, there are skills that underpin them. The idea of collaboration with your peers, the idea of effective and clear communication, the idea of working towards a common goal. So there are lots of things lots of skills, character traits, etc. I think that are developed, encouraged through these sorts of activities. And I think my experience of education was such that we were encouraged to be doing as much of those things, the academic elements. And as a consequence, I think that's where this term roundedness comes, because I think, we were encouraged to do all of these things. And I think as a consequence, we perhaps became more efficient communicators, more efficient team players, more efficient logical and lateral thinkers, possibly. And that's not to say we're all brilliant. There's definitely a range and a spectrum there. But I think because you were in those instances where you were needing to use those skills, those character traits, I think that really sort of heightened the need for them and therefore encouraged the development of them. So, I mean, in sport, which was something that I really enjoyed doing, there's definitely a space where all of these sorts of things are fundamental to the effective engagement with that sport or any sport, whether that be individual or team for that matter. So I definitely experienced a lot of those, was able to develop a lot of those skills in playing sport. But I was an all-round scholar, so I was encouraged / asked basically to ensure that my brief at school was pretty broad at senior school. So I had to maintain music. I had to be involved was also expected to be involved on the sports field. And so as a consequence, therefore, and perform well in the classroom. So I think I was encouraged across the board.
And, of course, you were a scholar, so things were very different for you. But for the children or the other students who were at the same level, did the school have any additional programs or did they encourage them in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, ironically, scholars in my time weren't hugely different in my school setting. I mean, there are schools where scholars are separated if they're academic and they're in certain boarding houses, if it's a boarding school. They might have different insignia, different sort of wardrobe, different medals or badges or whatever. We didn't really have that at Cheltenham, so weren't even recognised as one in the sense that it wasn't like everybody else knew necessarily. It was just more that the school knew, and therefore your housemaster or head of year and your tutor knew, and therefore they were to encourage you basically to honour that. And there were, in some instances, conditions to the scholarship. I think these sorts of things are less and less now. But yeah, so I don't think the kind of the non-scholar or the non-bursary candidate or whatever was able to access less. And actually, in those days, there weren't these specialist programs, which there are now for scholars, if you see what I mean. My brother is a housemaster in a big independent school and used to run a talented athlete program. We never had that. So essentially, all the sports scholars would be on a special program of nutrition and strength and conditioning and things like that. I mean, that would never have existed. The ones I can think of that probably do still exist are the fact that music lessons for music scholars typically are paid for by the school if you're a music scholar, as opposed to parents. So you get a certain access to those, and they're pretty expensive. So that was a real benefit, really. Whether or not the students really quite appreciated that, I'm not sure, but certainly the parents, I'm sure, would have really appreciated the fact that, a music scholar is often playing 2 or 3 instruments. That's probably, possibly 1-2 lessons a week individually for an hour. So it's probably a sizable addition to a bill at the end of term. So I would say, whilst obviously we have things like streaming and setting it academically and things like that, which will differentiate children into groups, I think broadly speaking, in terms of kind of the access to what the school offers in broad terms, I would say most schools encourage all students to engage in as much of that as they possibly can. I don't think there's sort of the reserve for a certain type of student or a certain group of students so much. There are obviously clearly exceptions to that, but I would say in general terms, I think it's kind of, roll your sleeves up and get involved. That's the encouragement, whoever you are and wherever you're from.
And you mentioned that, students who are now playing sport are on a special diet and there's a special nutrition plan for them. But aside from this, what else has changed for students going to school these days?
Obviously, I think culturally, so it depends on what we're talking about in education system. So I've taught in the state system and taught very, very briefly in the private system, and obviously was educated in both as well. So I don't think this is an answer to both. I think in the independent sector, what's changed vastly, and this is simply observationally from my point of view, but is that the facilities and the access are quite extraordinary now. And when you go around an independent school, what they have on offer to their students, whether that be sporting, musical, dramatic, music, academic, whatever, they've really sort of dialed that up. And a lot of that is through facilities development. So they've definitely improved and developed their facilities, and they're extending sites that they have. I guess some people call that an arms race between schools, saying we've got the latest, greatest music hall, or etc. So I think there's definitely been sort of a physical change in a lot of the schools. I think what's going to be really interesting now is the sort of value proposition change. So how compelling schools are in demonstrating to would-be parents and existing parents, quite frankly, what the value for money proposition is. And I think that's particularly key because obviously, while school fees naturally have inflated, they've gone up year on year on year. I say naturally. I mean, that's a decision for schools to make, to do. There is the sort of pending addition of VAT on school fees in the UK. And so I think that's really it's likely that most schools will pass that on. I know that some schools have suggested they won't to parents, but if they do, I do wonder whether that's going to pose more questions to some parents saying, is it really worth it? And I think that value proposition is going to be really interesting and see how schools demonstrate this to their current and would-be parents. I mean, that said, it's not like I don't think they've been doing that. It's just that that's going to be a very important sort of aspect of customer engagement now. So I think in terms of, facilities, physically, the schools have changed. They've also got sort of much bigger in many ways in terms of what they can offer. The kind of list of activities seemed endless now. Even in subjects, I think the breadth of subject study you can do in a lot of these places. And I would actually put that across the state as well. So it's not like, I think that's a preserve in academic terms of the independent sector. So I think choice is a lot wider. We never had computer science, for example. We didn't really have psychology back then. Now that's one of the most popular A-levels that there is. So there was certainly there's more choice. And I wonder whether that's also driven slightly by parental demand, but also wanted to show parents that, we can offer you the world sort of thing, or we can offer your child the world. So I think they are different places. Going back to my old school feels very different. Also things like accommodation in boarding schools, that's now extraordinary. And now maybe that, I just reflect back and go, God, it was, not so great in my times, but it just did feel a lot less comfortable than it does now. Now that may just be subjective and a change of perception, but, ensuite bathrooms and things like that, we never had any of that. But also schools have had to change because policy has changed. Back then you were able to do certain things because safeguarding didn't preclude you from doing so. Simple things like, as you said, communal showers, communal baths, those sorts of things. They wouldn't be countenanced today, I think, if you were building a new boarding house. So I think there are things that schools have just had to evolve over time, particularly boarding schools, I think, where you've got people living on a site. And of course, there are state boarding schools as well, and presumably they've had to evolve and develop as well to meet, standards effectively is I guess what I'm saying. School food, choice. There never used to be a choice on our side. It was vegetarians were very rarely and poorly, I think, catered for when I was at school. Just as a point of difference. Now it seems like, there's sort of 5 or 6 main options and you can choose. It's a bit like going to a restaurant. Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, that's a preserve of the independent sector, definitely. Albeit that, I taught in a school which had pretty good food within the state sector. So, I think schools have changed, definitely. Physically, they've changed. I think that offering has got broader. What I'm interested in is whether you can maintain that offering in a world where I think your customers under slightly more pressure, potentially financially speaking.
But a lot of people incline towards homeschooling, given the fact that school fees is going up and things like that. Or do you think that's still a long shot?
Yeah, so we do quite a lot of homeschooling at Keystone. We work with probably between 40 and 50 students a year. I would still say the lion's share of them are to do with some sort of social, medical, emotional, psychological or geographical issue, which effectively has meant they've got to be out of school for some reason. But there are an increasing number, definitely, that do, opt for homeschooling. 2 things I would say there is that, I think a good homeschooling program, often is equitable in cost to independent school fees, possibly even more so, because obviously it's one-to-one, etc., those sorts of things. And I also don't think it's a replica to it. So I think if I was a parent I was in the independent sector thinking, well, I might homeschool now. Yeah, you might get wonderful academic instruction and that would be great. But I think school, whether that be independent or state, is so much more than that. And particularly in the independent sector where they really beef up the offering of, the extracurriculars. And in some state schools, they did. My state school was wonderful at that, had a really great extracurricular offering to students, which I thought was brilliant. So I think that's a kind of an interesting consideration. And I think that you don't get that when you go homeschooling. I think that puts a lot of pressure on the parent to then, how do they engage with local sports clubs? How do they get the music and the drama and the whatever else in? The collaborative work, basically, that you do with other students. And that, of course, has social implications, I think, for the development of a child. So I think homeschooling can be a wonderfully effective tool. But I think as a choice, I think that needs really careful planning. And of course, the people that do it, they're often very committed to that. That's great. And they'll also have particular educational beliefs and values that they believe homeschooling really espouses or gives them, which another option wouldn't. I guess what you're suggesting is sort of this choice between independent or homeschooling. And I don't necessarily think that's too much of a choice commonly, because I think they're very different. And so I think you'd be leaving an independent school probably to choose homeschooling because you didn't feel the independent school did something for you and you felt that homeschooling would do something for you. I don't think it's kind of an either or, really, in my view.
Yeah. And, you obviously, going back a little bit to your education and your journey, you studied at St. Andrews. How was that? How did you prepare for it? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, it sort of was much easier in my day to do these things. I often say to my wife who I met at St. Andrews, I'm not sure that we'd get in now, and I'm not sure that we would be as successful as we were then. So I think grades are inflated, schools are churning out more and more and more top grades, and I think getting into the top universities, even if you look at the entrance requirements now with the addition of the A star, that was before my time. It's after my time, the A star. So I think it's a tough draw now for students applying to the top universities. I think it's pretty competitive, and I think it requires really committed preparation as well. In terms of mine, school did a pretty good job. I mean, I had a great tutor. He was constantly dragging me through the process. I don't think I was particularly proactive. It's quite interesting. As a teacher, when I was doing this with students, I really used my personal circumstances to explain how not to do it. Because I think I was very like last minute. I was quite reactive. I didn't really worry about the deadline so much. I didn't research. I didn't really think about it. I mean, the irony is I turned up to St Andrews. The first time I ever visited was when I started on day one. And so,
wow.
And I went on the judgment. Yeah, I went on the judgment of my tutor. I said, where do you think I should go? And he said, I think you might enjoy this place. And it was literally the other end of the country. It was in another country to I live in England, and obviously it's in Scotland. So, but it couldn't be further away if I tried from where I lived to my hometown and things like that. So I turned up, and luckily it was great. And the person that advised me, which I think is a really good point actually to make, and students don't realize enough, is that this person had known me for 4 years. And so really understood and watched me develop through my teenage years and I guess starting to become an adult. I would argue starting because, still at 17, I think we think we're adults, but the reality is there's quite a long way to travel yet. Absolutely. And I think they were very well placed to say, look, I think this is a great option for you. I remember being quite interested at that time. I had offers from everywhere. So I had 5 options when I chose my sort of firm and insurance. And I remember being more swayed by another university or something, and said, I'm not sure though. And asking him, and he then came up with the university that I probably would have least thought of on my list. And it was great. He was 100% spot on. It was an amazing experience. In terms of preparation, yeah, school did a good job. They gave us sort of workshops on personal statements and things like that, and so we knew what we were doing. But there wasn't the pressure that I think is felt today. Yeah. We didn't have AS/A2, so we just had. We had just had A levels, and you did them at the end of the cycle. So that was quite an interesting thought, which is quite different to now, or sort of different to now in many respects. So I often wonder whether my sixth form experience was more enjoyable than the average now. I had so much fun playing a lot of sports. I was in plays and things like that, and I just don't think I would countenance that now in an independent school. I just feel like university exit outcomes. There's a lot of pressure that goes with that. And I'd be really intrigued. I mean, I know these schools and state schools do wonderful jobs in supporting students through their journey, but I'm thinking about me, myself, and whether I would be doing that. And I'm sure I'd be ably supported and I would do all the same things I did before. But I feel like there's a greater sense of urgency there than there was when perhaps I was there. And obviously, because there's greater competition now. Correct. I think preparation has had to step up.
And I think now there are a lot more international students as well. So you're not just competing with students in the UK, but now the growing numbers of students coming from all over the world, I'm sure that adds to the pressure because there's only so many students that the university can accept.
Yeah. I remember when we went to St Andrews, I was there when Prince William was there. And I think that massively sort of shot the numbers of students up. Particularly, I think women. There were many more female applicants. I'm not sure whether it's because they all wanted to be the Duchess of Cambridge, but we also had some universities have very good links already and had established links, and St Andrews was one of them. They had very good links with America, so there used to be a lot of exchange, a lot of students applying from America. So I think that's also the case. But you're absolutely right. International numbers across the board. Since I was at university, which is a long time ago now, have significantly risen. So the competition for places is much greater now.
Did you ever become friends with Prince Williams or not really?
I can't claim that. I wonder how many stories there are that exist on those grounds. I watched an aberration because I feel like he did get stuck in to university life in a way where it was pretty normal. I mean, as normal as I imagine you could be given who he is. So we definitely sort of engaged each other in certain areas, like on the sports field. I played some rugby sevens against him and things like that. But he was a relatively, I say relatively because obviously he really wasn't, but normal student by all accounts. And I don't know how he reflects on it, but I think publicly he's very positive about his experience there. It was a great time, and it's a lovely place. It's very small. There's about 7,000 students in a square mile. Yeah. So it's quite like school in some ways. I would argue that it becomes quite irritating at the end of the term. At the end of the term, you want to go home and get out of the bubble because, you can't go to Tesco's and get your shopping without seeing 5 or 6 people on the way there, and probably 3 or 4 people in the shop. And it's quite intense in that way. But I loved it academically and socially, and some of my greatest friends in life I found there. So I can't complain, and I really enjoyed it.
And I think Scotland is beautiful. I mean, it's one of my favorite places in the world. I went to Isle of Skye, I remember, a couple of years ago, and I drove from London. And I don't think there's a place like that in the world. It was absolutely beautiful. I loved it.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I'm a big fan of it. In my role as an advisor, I always find it very difficult to advocate Edinburgh or Glasgow or St Andrews. And that's because everyone just thinks it's miles from anywhere. And obviously London is for international students particularly, that's just such a magnet.
Yeah.
And actually, if they thought a bit more broadly and they were willing to take a bit more risk, I think they would be really pleasantly surprised. It's a bit colder, of course. But I guess the advantage of being on the East Coast is a little bit less wet. If you're in the Glasgow West Coast scenario, I'm informed reliably by ardent Scots that it's a bit wetter than the East. But yeah, it's a beautiful part of the world, and I had a great time.
And, after St Andrews, you, of course, went to Oxford and you did your master's in teaching and learning. How did you make that transition? How did you decide to start teaching?
Yeah, so at the end of St Andrews, I kind of realised by that time there are some great programs you can do in universities where you go into local state schools and you're supporting. And I did one for about a year in my final year, and I worked in quite a difficult area. South St Andrews is a lovely part of Scotland, but like anywhere in the UK, you can find lovely areas. You can find areas of deprivation. I guess that's slightly different to India, but obviously there is deprivation in the UK to some extent. And I went to a pretty rundown coastal town just south of St Andrews by about 40 minutes. And it was in a big secondary school there, helping with science. That's my background. And it was really amazing. It was really interesting. It was pretty sort of rough and ready and quite intimidating at times. But the students were lovely, and I certainly got a real kick out of helping. There were some students there who were desperate to go to universities like St Andrews or desperate to go to top universities, things like that. I got a real kick out of helping them. There were also students who just were desperate to get a particular grade because that would mean that they could then go on to vocational qualifications and skilled work and things like that. So there were different students who had different ambitions, quite starkly different in some cases. And I just got a real kick out of kind of working with them and helping and doing my bit in terms of on their educational journey and adding some value. And I think when I realized that was something that potentially could be really quite neat and I get a lot of satisfaction out of it, then I decided to do that too. I also kind of dabbled in trying to be some sort of professional rugby player and then coaching. And I think coaching, I got a lot out of coaching people. And I think and had some reasonable success with that as well. And I think what that taught me was that actually, that's great if you can harness an individual or a team or a group or whatever to achieve a sort of common goal. There's a real sense of satisfaction that you get from that process. And so I saw teaching as kind of a more formalized version of coaching. And I guess at this stage, still in my age, coaching wasn't sort of a professional vocation yet. I don't think in football it probably would have been, but in the sports that I was interested in, like rugby, it was still, really the reserve of the absolute elite. And so I didn't think there was a kind of a viable option really. So teaching seemed to me like a logical next step. And it also would enable me if I taught in certain schools to do coaching as well. So I thought I'd get a lot of satisfaction out of that. And that's, that was a big pull. So I decided to do my PGC at Oxford, and then I taught, and then I did my master's in teaching and learning. So I did my master's in teaching and learning whilst on the job rather than kind of taking a sort of a year out to do it. So that was really, really great fun, if not exhausting. Yeah.
How is Oxford different from St Andrews? Like, of course, you were older. There was a lot more you had to do, and it wasn't really like your undergraduate degree. But how is it different in terms of the sort of professors and the campus?
Yeah, I'm probably. I don't think I'm a complete outlier, but I found Oxford really underwhelming.
Really?
Yeah.
I think it's the first person in the world who has said that.
I actually found it quite disappointing. I kind of there's two reasons why. One, I built it up to be, really, really great. And it was, there were elements of it that I really, really enjoyed. I guess you've got to get two things straight though. The first is that, when I was doing a PGCE, you're obviously then teaching as well at the same time. So you're not in university at the same time all the time. So it's very different to doing kind of a straight master's in kind of research or something. And when I did the Master in Teaching and Learning, I was only dipping in and dipping out because you were effectively doing it on the job. So my experience was quite different, I think, to the average postgraduate in many ways. I guess underwhelming because I wanted more from it. I wanted it to deliver more. I thought that I would get these sort of really nourishing conversations and I'd, be enlightened in some way and really enjoyed it. There was a particular person there who was instrumental in my life, I think. At the time, I don't think she would know that she is, but I just found my interactions with her just great. She was obviously a highly adept teacher in and of her own right, and then turned researcher and worked as a don at Oxford. And she just really, really gentle, but really insightful. And I think I enjoyed my interactions with her, but I almost didn't get that many. And so, yeah, I sort of, it's also kind of eclectic mix as well, people. And I think that was interesting. It was challenging at times because it was very different to my previous university. But yeah, I sort of felt like I wasn't able to extract all the juice from it, if that makes sense. And then I also felt that it didn't work that hard for me either, if that makes sense. There was quite a high level of expectation, but I don't feel like I met that, but I don't feel like it gave me back as much as perhaps I'd wanted it to. So, yeah, and I think this is a really good lesson actually for students is that, we have a lot of students who are very, very focused on getting to Oxford or Cambridge or LSE or somewhere else or Imperial or whatever. And I think they build these places up to be things they're not. And really understanding what the mundane will look like, the day-to-day, the essay expectations and the turnaround times and those sorts of things, and how the teaching and learning will work and how much interaction with certain people you'll get and that sort of stuff. I think that's really good. I think because that gives you a really accurate view of what life might be like. And the problem I think I found was that I perhaps didn't do enough of that. Like I knew I wanted to go there. It worked very well for me. It was much closer to home. This was my next step. I'd already been at university for 4 years, so I needed to think carefully about travel and cost and things like that. So I'm really glad I went, but and I'm very proud of what I've done there. But I think it wasn't as enjoyable as St Andrews. I really enjoyed St Andrews academically speaking. I felt really stretched and challenged, and I enjoyed the wider life of being in St Andrews greatly. And I'm very thankful of going. I'm very thankful to my tutor because without him, I'd never be where I am now. I wouldn't have met my wife. I wouldn't have met all the great friends that I have now. And I just wouldn't have done that. And that was more on someone really taking the time to go, I think this is the right place for you. And I think that's why schools and teachers are so important to students. I think students.
Absolutely.
I think that's an important point that I think we get lost in the melee of school. And actually, if you just sit down with a subject teacher or a teacher knows you well and say, look, these are my options. What do you think would be best for me? It's very difficult with 17 to make a decision, that has a quite significant impact in your life.
And you don't even know what exists, even though you may think you do, there's still so much out there that you have no idea about. And teachers can really change that for you, which is why it's so important, especially in a country like India, where there are so many bright people, super academic, very clever. They really, what we really lack is well-trained teachers across the board to be able to guide students in the right direction. I think if they just had that, the choices they would make would be so different because especially now, there are so many students from India who go to the UK, US, etc. to study. And often they make choices based on whichever university is popular. And then once they graduate, they actually feel like, was that even the right choice for me? They actually don't know how to choose the right universities. And it's a very, very difficult job to tell them this is the right place for you and this is not the right place for you. And I'm sure some of them don't even know which ones exist.
I think that exists all through at school choice, at university choice. Our consultants and our tutors struggle with that every day. And I think managing expectations is a critical part of working in education, whether you being in a school or in a tutoring organization or being an educational consultant. And I think the reality is that a little bit of information, I think, in the wrong hands or with the wrong intention slightly, it can really confuse and befuddle things. I think league tables, there are, in my view, always at university and at school. It's just so frustrating because I think they really don't tell us much. And I think school is so much more than that, and university is so much more than that.
Absolutely.
And as we've described, obviously implicitly as opposed to explicitly, but St Andrews was the right fit for me because the person sat there and thought, well, where would be the right environment for this individual? And it's also the benefit of the fact it was a good university in and of its own right, but the reality is they were really thinking about that rather than thinking, what's the university with the greatest kudos on that list, or what's the university that ranks the highest. And so I think that's critical. Whether you're choosing a school or choosing a university, you've got to focus on what you're going to be doing there first and whether that suits you. So in the case of university, course choice. In the case of the school, does the school profile fit you? Does the interests of the school align with your interests and the interests you'd like to develop? And then I think the second point then is thinking about, more broadly, the environment and the nature of what you're going to have to do. In my case, Scotland is a long way away from where I'm going to live. So, that's a huge commitment. And so does that work for me? Or do I want to be a bit closer to home because I want to be able to go home more regularly or whatever that might be? So I think it's a multifaceted process, educational choice. But I often think we spend too much time focusing on things like data, particularly league tables. And I find them quite frustrating personally, as I know schools do. And I think universities do as well, because I don't think they paint it anywhere near the full picture.
And, after Oxford, of course, you joined Keystone in 2012 as a managing director. Of course, you love teaching. You were always passionate. You did that already when you're in Scotland. How did you decide to join Keystone and really scale it to make it the number one tutoring company in the UK?
I don't think I can take all the credit for that, but and also there's a slight timeline check on that. So I left Oxford first time round and then became a teacher and then was teaching in a school in South Oxfordshire and really enjoying it and loving it, in fact, actually, and had no intention of leaving. Okay. And was very much enjoying my time and was progressing well in terms of both my teaching, my pedagogy, but also, I guess, in terms of my professional development and where I was headed potentially within the context of the school structure. But as ever in life, there are other things that are personal things. And my better half was based in London and I was based in Oxford. And that was always tricky and challenging. And I think trying to kind of align ourselves a little bit better, I realized that, if we were going to, go down the road to where we are now, married, children, probably one of us needed to give. So, and I thought that probably it might be more sensible. The other thing I thought, which is that I'd always got the most inspiring teaching from those that had done something outside of school. So they weren't institutionalized the whole way. So they'd been in the world of commerce in some way. Some of my best teachers from my secondary school were definitely those people. So they had a little bit of color somewhere else, some other bit and piece they did. It may have been for a very short period of time, but you could see that was woven into their lessons and woven into the advice they gave you. And so I thought, look, this is great and I'm loving it and I'm enjoying it. There's this personal reason why I might need to move to London or whatever. But there's also this kind of latent professional reason, which is that, I want to have a bit more interest or something to combine with the teaching. And maybe that makes me even better teacher further down the line, different experiences. And I was quite keen on all of that. So yeah, in a February half term, I went down and did loads of interviews in London, lots of things from shipbroking to insurance broking to tech to, all sorts of things, accountancy, big graduate firms, tiny firms, the whole lot. And at the end of it, all I knew, and I think I did about 18 interviews in 1 week or something like something ridiculous like that. I was exhausted in half term when I should be actually resting and ready for the second half term. At the end of it, I was like, what have I learned? Like I had a few job offers, which was great, but I was like, the only thing that all these people could talk about was sort of like, well, you can earn X in Y time. And really what I looked at is I wanted to find people that I really wanted to work for. Or was inspired by, much in the same way teaching and coaching is that, you're inspired by or you're going to work hard for. And I just didn't see that. So I thought, that's it. I'm going to go back to school. Can't really find anything. Going to try and find another school in London. That might be the way to do it. And then, I actually first started tutoring for Keystone because a boy was expelled from a school and lived very close to where I lived. And they were looking for a tutor who could teach him biology and chemistry. And I was teaching biology and chemistry at the time. Edward Bardagy. And so I taught him exactly the syllabus that I was teaching at school after schools. And it was great fun. And really, really interesting. And I learned a lot about tutoring then. I didn't really know about it prior to that. I didn't know it existed. And I then saw, because I was then connected to the organization a while later, I then saw that this advert being published. It was actually for a director of education. So the two founders, Will and Josh, it was for their first real appointment, their first salaries, I think. possibly full-time salary, possibly is the right way. And it's a long time ago. We were sort of an institution of one, subcontractors only, whereas now we're an organization of 80 plus, and we've got 65 or 63 salary tutors, so plus 230 odd self-employed subcontractors. So it's grown exponentially, and obviously that's Will and Josh's company. It's a large part to do with them, but my job was to professionalize the tutoring. So I guess I brought more of the educational focus, because these guys, neither Will have worked briefly in a school, but Josh hadn't, and I was really interested in research, and I'd done my teaching qualifications and things like that. So that's kind of what I brought to the company, I guess, and that soon after I joined, we then decided to go to recruit professional tutors, to salary them, and move forward from there. So it was a really interesting time, and then about just over 2 years ago now, Will and Josh have stepped back and they've gone and done something different, and so then I became managing director. So it's I've seen the evolution of Keystone, both in terms of the people that have been in the team, but also in terms of the services and the products and the families that we work with, and who we work with. That's hugely changed. When I first joined, it was predominantly London families, and then quite soon after that, we started to have a presence in Asia, and then Indian subcontinent and things like that, and then globally once online. We were online tutoring 10 years ago. And so we started to advocate that a lot. So it's and now schools, for example, both in the UK and internationally. So
how do you work with schools though? Like, what is your format with them?
So our elective service effectively is kind of filling the gap that the school has. So in some schools, we teach whole A levels. So if they want to offer a particularly niche A level, which they don't want to employ a member of staff for, maybe they've only got 4 children who want to do that A level. And let's say an A level in computer science or something, it would be quite costly for the school to employ a teacher, and that teacher, of course, then is on the staff permanently. So you can't kind of expand and contract your teaching staff easily on the employment mechanism. So we do whole A levels. Sometimes we do part of an A level, or part of a subject where the school has half a teacher worth, but they don't have the other half because of timetabling. And so we do online half of it, and they do face-to-face in person the other half. We do Oxbridge and university preparation in international schools. We do SEN and EAL development. So, schools are often strapped for helping students one-to-one and developing that, albeit that's kind of a part of their brief and what they're there to do. And we also do extension and enrichment. So in a big secondary academy group, they were aiming for a lot more A stars in an A-level year. So they were having extra sessions with our tutors in order to develop a chance of doing that. In an international school, they had a group of students who weren't quite getting to the grade. So they were more like sort of aiming for sort of a C or a B, and we were sort of supporting them to rise them up. But we've also done extension on things like would-be authors want to learn how to write creatively and in fiction. And so we've run programs and design programs on how they can do that. We've had groups of students across schools that want to be lawyers. And so we've done an introduction to law course and things like that. So essentially trying to pick up the gaps that schools might have in provision and work alongside them to fill those. But I would say the predominance is around university preparation, EAL, SEND, and then crucially delivering A levels, GCSEs, IGCSEs. And we've actually helped with IB now, which I know is a very big and expanding market in India.
And do you help them primarily with only UK universities or also universities in the US?
Just UK. Yeah. No, the US is I think it's a whole nother kettle of fish. Absolutely. When I've observed it from the outside for 17 years or something, and I can't pretend to know anything, but I obviously have picked up things as I've gone, but it seems pretty complicated. I'm sure with a very good advisor, and we have a view that we refer on to, you can break that down very quickly and very easily and demystify it for students. But no, we don't do that. We don't do Europe as well, which has become increasingly popular actually for UK-based students. So we don't do that either. But we refer families on to advisors that do have experience in doing that.
Okay. And, you mentioned that, you were helping students who were, say, getting a grade C and you wanted them to go up to, a better grade. How do your tutors ensure that students are getting better? Because that's a huge commitment and it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But is there something special that Keystone does that allows students to get better?
I think Keystone is informed by one word, and I think it's professional. And I think that's, I'm not to say that any other tutoring company in the world isn't, but I think that's the word around which we build our service, whether that be the person on the phone who's, first engaging a client, whether that be our tutor delivering, the session to the student. And I think, and anywhere in between that. But I think it's just a really systematic approach, I think. So, often our lessons start with an assessment. At the beginning of our mission, start with an assessment to understand where the student strengths, areas of development are. And then effectively, we then have a program which we then work on those areas. And obviously, by doing so, you're likely to then improve their chances of scoring well. We clearly try to work with schools, in this case, the example is, but obviously parents to really understand, what is known about the student and why is it that they're scoring this grade?
Yes.
What is it that they need to improve? So it's not just our own assessment. We're also bringing in data from outside. But I think the other point and the final point, and it's not to say this always works, and that's not what I'm saying, but often it's the case that, and I know this as a teacher, is that, in a class of 20 to 30 kids, and I've got a child that's not doing quite as well, I don't have that time to really sit and focus with them and to reinforce learning or to unpick misconceptions or to, really break down exam skills for that individual. I'll try my best, and I'll definitely try to do that as a whole group exercise, possibly differentiate for the more able, the middle, and the less able, definitely. But it's unlikely I'm going to be able to really get around everybody all of the time. There'll definitely be times I can do that, but I doubt I'll be able to do that all of the time. So I guess what tutoring does in that one-to-one environment can do, or maybe possibly in a small group, is it just gives the opportunity for a little bit more scrutiny, a little bit more focus and advice and guidance to the individual. And I think that goes a long way. That's not to say that just simply by having tutoring, you'll improve your grades, because I think that's often a huge misconception that people think that, tutoring plus student equals better grade. I don't think that does, because, students need to leave the tutoring session much as you should do when you're being taught in the classroom. You leave and you need to consolidate upon that learning in your own time. You need to build on that. And I think that's often the step that a lot of students fail to do. They go, well, I've got my tutor, so I've done my lesson. I don't need to do any more.
Exactly. Yeah. And everyone talks about personalized learning. What is personalized learning in your opinion, really? Like, how do parents inculcate that or choose the right tutors to ensure that their children are getting exposed to that personalized learning that's really required in today's day and age?
I just think it's a commitment to understand the individual. I think that's it. Because I think if I understand you, it doesn't matter what I'm teaching you. It means that I then can think about what I'm teaching you. And because I now know you and understand you and I really get kind of how you work, I can deliver what I'm teaching in a way that I think is going to best suit you. And I think that's the critical point. I think it's taking the time to understand the individual. And obviously, it's a bit of chicken and egg, because you're going to have to start. So you get to start delivering something. But over that time, it's that commitment to understanding. So that then each time you're delivering or redelivering information, you're thinking about the individual first and then thinking about what that means with respect to delivering this information or reinforcing this information. And I think is taking that time. And I think that's the key bit. I mean, I'm really interested in education research. I do think a lot of it is cyclical. It comes around and fades, and sort of fashions and sort of trends. And I think it's a great term, but in many ways, I would suggest that lots of teachers and tutors out there would say, I'm committed to that, because I really do try to get to understand my children and the students that I work with, and make sure that I tailor the learning as best as I can, to them to sort of meet their needs. So I think for me, that's what personalized learning is really thinking about the individual that you've got in front of you, as well as the content that you've got to deliver or teach with them or reinforce with them. I think there's often a time factor in that, where we're just thinking we just got to get through the material and I'm just going to deliver it. And this worksheet will do. Yeah. And you're not thinking about actually whether that worksheet will do in the context of the student you've got in front of you.
And that's a really hard job, but how do you motivate your tutors to keep personalizing it, or to keep, in trying to sort of keep it alive and interactive in every session? Because I'm sure, the first few, even at Instrucko, where we have so many teachers who are teaching students between the age of 3 and 15, we see that we have to constantly motivate them to do better or to just be engaged in every session, because after a few sessions, they also sort of lack that energy, which they should have in every session, because for that child, it's that 30 minutes, 40-minute session that's going to change everything for them.
I don't have a kind of a hard and fast instructional sort of thing. This is what we do to motivate them. I would say we have a very stringent recruitment process. So I think we are pretty tricky to get into. I think in general terms, as tutoring would go, we have the sort of same barriers and a recruitment process often that schools would have. And so what we're really looking for is genuine commitment. We're also looking for people who are doing it very regularly. And so as a consequence, if you're doing it very regularly, you're pretty likely to enjoy doing it. If you don't, then that's a slightly odd sort of turn of events, I think. So the recruitment process, I think, really helps to ensure that we get right individuals. And we have qualities that we're screening for that we believe makes very good tutors. And so I think we have a very good and clear vision as to what good tutoring looks like. And we're asking tutors to deliver lessons to us as a part of their admissions process. I think with regards to subcontracted tutors, I think you've just got to be there and listen and talk to them as much as possible so they feel supported. There's a limit to what we can do because we shouldn't really control them too much. I know that sounds quite odd to say that, but the reality is sort of employment law dictates that. We are subcontracting out the work to them. What we do have is quite clear, hopefully, communication channels. We're really clear about what the brief is of the job. We're really clear about what's expected, what needs to be focused on, the timing, the reporting, those sorts of things. So I think that really kind of emboldens and supports tutors. I would hope they would say that. On the professional side, the tutors that we employ, we train them every 6 weeks. So they're looking and reflecting on their practice. They're thinking about what they're doing that's working well and what they want to kind of improve and develop. And we call those actions for development. So they're constantly looking at their practice all the time. And I think by factor of doing that and being reflective on your practice, you're very likely to improve and develop. And obviously that's going to have a significant impact on the outcomes of the students that you work with. So I think that we do make a very conscious effort. We have a designs continual professional development program for the employed tutors. Sadly, as much as we'd love to give it to our self-employed tutors, we're unable to do that because they're self-employed.
And, parents often feel like offline tutoring is more effective than online tutoring, but it's not. What are your views on that? Do you think it's pretty much the same, or do you think offline tutoring does have a bigger or better impact on students?
I mean, before the pandemic came along, we thought that it's a lot. So we were trying to kind of really advocate for it because obviously we wanted to serve these tutors that were fully employed in London, in the UK, with clients who are based internationally. And obviously when you're going into international markets, you're competing against tutoring centres that exist, physical sites that children get dropped off to. And so other than the convenience factor, which is to say to mum and dad, look, you don't need to drive your child to the tutoring centre, they can do it at home, and which obviously for some people is a real sell. Absolutely. The other point is you've got to, what is the advantage of this and how is it different? Is it better? Is it not? Our view on it is that, I guess, two things. One is that it's entirely child dependent. So I think, for example, and these are general stereotypes, you're obviously going to be dependent on the child. I would say the lower you go in age, the more challenging online is typically, because necessarily they're not as computer literate, but I do think, bringing them back to the task at hand, behavior management, concentration and levels of focus. I think being really alert and aware to that online is more challenging, but it can be done. So I think that's the first thing. And also in terms of children and types of children, I would say particularly neurodiverse children, that can be difficult, particularly if you've got things like ADHD and concentration as a factor online. Bringing them back to the task at hand, that can often be a bit more of a challenge. But I do think she are really adept actually at observing and picking up on the visual and non-verbal cues possible. That's why it's so critical. I think cameras are on. Students definitely got into a bit of a habit in COVID and turning the cameras off. And I think without that, I think that becomes very difficult to teach effectively. But I would say in general terms, on average, if you had a sort of an average child in that, and obviously that you never do, but I don't see a significant difference. And in fact, I could see some advantages. For example, note taking. Let's just take that as one thing. You're doing that on an interactive whiteboard. It's there physically there in space. You can access it at any time. It also is neater often because yes, you have styluses, but styluses autocorrect for handwriting particularly, but you can also type. You can color code. You can lay out notes more visually, logically and impressively, which means that reflecting can also be helpful. Also, order and structure. Notes can be, marked, and lessons can be denoted, and PDFs can be created. And I think that's really nice. Don't get me wrong, I love pen and paper. In fact, as a teacher, I did some research into why students respond to handwritten worksheets better than they do typed ones. And I looked at that, and that's because they can see the teacher has put some time into making this. This isn't just a generic thing off the internet. So I think there's a huge value, don't get me wrong, in handwritten note taking and things like that. But I do think that, that relies on the individual a huge amount. Will they take the right notes? Will they be neat? Will they be legible? Will they, be impactful? Those sorts of things. So I think there are huge advantages there. As an example, the ability to get stuff onto the screen. I'm suddenly talking to you about fusion, the difference between fusion and fission. I can get a YouTube clip in a second and bring that onto the board. That's quite tricky to do in a face-to-face lesson unless you've got the right materials around you. And in fact, actually what we saw after the pandemic, but also before the pandemic, is how can you bring an online lesson into a face-to-face lesson? So we still see tutors using whiteboards, but in face-to-face sessions, because that's a really good way of noting everything you've got down. It's there, it's physically, it's a much easier access. And of course, parents can access that at any time. That's an also thing, which often you don't get the window into when you're a parent, is you can sit and listen, by the door. Does it sound good? But in the context of online, you can often join it. Just, turn your camera off and they'll pretty much forget you there after a while if the tutor's sharing screens. So there's lots of opportunity, I think. I would be reluctant to say one is better than the other, but I definitely would be quite ardent in saying that I don't think one is significantly worse than the other, and I really don't believe that. I think the same educational outcomes can be achieved in both. But I do think the type of student we're dealing with, and also arguably the tutor, we have some tutors who go, no, do you know what? I am much better in person. So, and I respect that. So it's also about your dexterity, and how you can deliver and how you feel you're going to make your biggest impact. So we're a huge fan of it. We do a huge amount of online work. It's now disproportionately more online than it is face to face. And I do think lots of things like the convenience, letting someone into your own home, I think that was always tricky, particularly if you had a tricky customer as well, or the relationship didn't quite work, and there's no doubt that students in their own home, on their own, online, potentially could be a little more comfortable. That may not be a good thing because they may get distracted easily. So I think there's swings and roundabouts with it all. But I think a tutor who's cognizant and mindful of these potential pitfalls of online, I think that means then you're really well safeguarded against it being unproductive. And we, again, with our professional tutors, we invest quite a lot of time into that, thinking about, how do you spot when someone isn't quite there, or and obviously there's the software that's very helpful at doing that now.
And what is your advice, for students and parents for parents who want to send their kids to the UK to study and, get into schools like the Oxbridge of the world? How do you, when do you think they should start preparing? And what do you think is really important for them to be aware of before they make the right decision?
So I always think it's really important to start as early as possible. That doesn't mean, when they're in the womb, but I definitely think, if you're going to come, let's say at 13 to a boarding school, I think you need to be thinking about it when you're 8 or 9 at the first outset. I think if you're going to come to Oxford, as a, art straight after school, I think you need to be thinking about that. So 3 years earlier. And it's not that you're going to be absolutely dead set on it at that point, but I think you need to be having a discussion around that and what that might look like. And I think then also coming and visiting and seeing what they look like. These schools and these universities are great, but and they obviously have wonderful websites and virtual tours and everything else that goes with it. But I think there is no substitute to being there and being present and seeing it and feeling it. And the final thing I think I'll say is, which I do think is a common trait amongst international candidates, is they always sort of, when you have your meeting with them, but you don't understand, my child is incredibly bright. And I'm always sitting there going, no, that's lovely and that's great. But it's a bit different to the UK, so you don't get it. And I said, no, I really do. But what you don't perhaps understand is that you might be from this country and you might be really bright there, but actually the really bright students from this country, this country, this country, this country, this country, and these other 20 countries are also applying to said university. And as a consequence, therefore, it's more about thinking about how the individual can be developed and as prepared as possible for this. I often think it's sort of parents and students turn up and go, well, look, this is me. So, am I going to get in? And it's sort of actually, it's great. You've done a wonderful amount of things, but now we need to hone this. We need to prepare this and make this specific, set off on a journey to ensure you're in the best possible position to make a competitive application. And I think that's, that can often be quite shocking for people. I think they sort of, but you don't understand, my child goes to the best independent school in India. He's, and is the top of his class. And I sit there and go, I understand that, but I really do, because I've actually seen over the last 10 years, at least 3 of these people a year. So I know what they look like, and I'm not doubting his ability in any way. But I think what I really want you to understand is just quite how competitive this process is, and how this process works, and how therefore your son or daughter needs to be prepared accordingly for that. So it's more the kind of managing that expectation that you can't just rock up and win a place or expect to win a place, I don't think. And that's not to advocate tutoring, because a lot of work could be done independently on their own without tutors. I'm not saying that. It's more to say that proper preparation, there is no substitute for it. And I think in order to do that, you need time. So in order to do that, you need to start your thinking early. So I think that's
the right people, right? I mean, often parents don't know who to really rely on. I know there's so many of instrucko's parents who keep asking me, which counselor should I speak to, or who is the right person to help my child get into this university. So even that selection process of who will help the student is very important.
Yeah, I agree totally. And I think that's a critical part of the process. Yeah, seeking help for international students is good. But I think if you start early as well, you can be pretty diligent. You can do quite a lot of research yourself. And I think if you're a university level student, I think that's really important. I think I'd like to see a student who's really thought about that and isn't relying on mum and dad to push them to get it. So I think, and indeed, a lot of them are. They're impressively diligent and independent, and that's great. And actually, in a lot of cases, you're just slightly tweaking the guidance a bit. You're saying, look, you're pointing in this direction. We want you a little bit over here. Then you're great. And I think often it's small changes in some cases, but in other cases, they've really underestimated quite what's at stake, and that's possibly because they haven't looked into it in great enough detail.
Great. So thank you so much, Ed. I think this was very insightful. We know a lot about universities, how to get into universities, the right preparation, the time that's needed. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be interested in Keystone and really how you teach, because it's such a unique, such a unique way of teaching. And I think everyone I've spoken to in the UK has only said amazing things about Keystone. So really, congratulations, and very excited to work with you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to speak to you.
Likewise. Thank you.